Well, good morning. I am so pleased to be here today to talk with you about my favorite topic, and that's soils. What I want to focus on this morning is the concept of soil savvy, and that just simply means knowing your soil properties for your particular landscape and using that knowledge to better manage your landscape. Now, before we get into the soils topic, I just want to point out to those of you who aren't familiar, I'm sure many of you are, but CSU Extension just has a wealth of information available for free on the website. I want to point out this website is really cool. It's fairly new, maybe a year old, David? Yeah. What's really cool about this one is it will take you to the Colorado Master Gardener Garden Notes or the Extension fact sheets, or you can also get onto the plant talks. And there's every topic on the planet you can think of referring to landscapes. Soil information, plant select, xeriscapes, irrigation, particular information about different types of plants, whether it's your lawn, flowers, veggies, trees, shrubs, insect information, diseases, raised beds, compost, mulch, container gardens. About any topic you can think of for landscapes, it's there. What's really cool is there's a Google box. So up in the upper right-hand corner, you can type in a topic, say like compost or xeriscapes or turf, and it will download the different fact sheets, the different garden notes, the different plant talks that pertain to that topic. You can also download a full listing. For those of you like me who, I still like my paper. I want to thumb through and see what's available. Another really cool website is CSU Soil Testing Lab website. And there you're going to get the information on what type of soil, plant, and water analyses are available for you, how much it costs. You can download a sample submission form, get sampling instructions. You can also use, this is fairly new, it's a CSU soil sampling kit. And I brought tons. Don't mind me. Okay. So you can pick up as many of these as you want. I've got this soil testing FAQ. Answers most of your questions on how do I sample, when do I sample, this type of thing. We won't have time today to go through all of that. I'll be here at break and I'll be here after to answer specific questions if you have them. These soil sampling kits you can get today, but they're also available at the Soil Testing Lab, the Extension office here in town, and a bunch of the nurseries are carrying them too. The third website I want to call your attention to is this one that Dr. Tony Koski runs. He's the CSU Turf Guru. And this website, CSU Turf Colo State, provides a wealth of information on home lawn care, fertilizing, watering, mowing, renovating. He's got links to the CSU fact sheets pertaining to lawn. There's a lot of information there about plant selection, the type of grasses. He puts recent presentations, books, references. This is a really useful site. Here's why I really like this information. You know, there's a wealth of knowledge out there. There's all kinds of gorgeous books. There's all kinds of websites. But if it's from another part of the country, if it's from Pennsylvania or Maine or Georgia or California, that information may or may not be particularly useful for us. We have a specific climate and specific soils. The thing I like about this information is it's based on research conducted in Colorado, on our soils and our climate, with our situations. So it's a wealth of good information. Okay, let's move on and talk soils. Well, I don't think you have to live in this part of the country very long to realize that we face a lot of challenges in trying to grow plants in our landscapes. And our climate is probably the most obvious contributor to plant problems we see. We have a dry climate. Most anything you're going to want to grow is going to need irrigation. We have a cool climate. Short growing season, even though some hot days, we've got cool nights, we've got a short growing season. Highly variable precip and temperatures. I mean, we can have a 75-degree day, hard freeze that night, and another 75-degree day. Same thing with precip. We've had what, 8 weeks, 6-8 weeks of essentially no precip. We could get a foot of snow tomorrow. We could get 2 inches of rain tomorrow. Very variable. And wind. It's a windy climate. It intensifies water loss from soils and plants. So water-smart landscapes are a really good idea here. I think that, you know, the climate is the most obvious contributor to soil or plant problems that we have here. But perhaps what people don't necessarily appreciate is the most common inciting factor to plant disorders in Colorado is the condition of the soil. And yet, you know, that's the one resource we tend to know the least about. Landscapers, gardeners can tell you at depth about every plant in their garden. They can probably even give you the name in Latin. They can tell you the diseases and the insects. But usually, not always, but usually they can tell you little, if anything, about what they're standing on. But here's the thing, soil is the fundamental component of any landscape. Whether you're talking a xeriscape, your lawn, your veggie garden, your orchard, it is the fundamental component. Soil conditions contribute to over 80% of any and all plant problems you're ever going to see on your landscapes. And that's because it's so crucial to plant health. The soil is what provides the plants with nutrients, with water. Those two are fundamental for plant growth, but it also supplies oxygen because roots have metabolic processes that require oxygen. Here's the thing, if your soil isn't healthy, your plants aren't going to be either. It just, you know, there's an old saying out there, if you feed and nurture the soil will then feed and nurture the plant. And I'm going to argue, how can you nurture this soil if you don't know anything about it? If you know the basic properties of your soil, of your particular soil, you can use that knowledge, you can use that information to improve the soil health. Thereby, what you're doing is better managing, better nurturing your landscape and your plants. And I argue that one of the best ways you can get an idea of your basic soil properties is, if you've never done it before, get a basic soil test. Know what your basic soil properties are. Now, you have this FAQ sheet that talks about soil testing. I've got these if you want to do soil testing. What you get here is a soil container. There's a sticker in there to put your name and information on, but inside is all the information you need on how to sample, as well as the submission form. You fill all that out, send it in, get a sample, and get it analyzed. I think this is the best way to at least get a baseline knowledge of your particular soil properties. What are those basic soil properties? I think these are the things you need to know if you want to manage your landscape well. It's important to know the texture of your soil. That's just simply how much sand, silt, and clay are in your soil. It's important to know the pH because pH influences important things like nutrient availability in the soil. It also influences the type of plants you can grow in your soil. You need to know the free lime content. Free lime is simply calcium carbonate. That's common in our soils, and free lime influences the pH level of your soil. You need to know your organic matter content. You need to know the salinity. Salinity is going to influence plant growth as well as microbial activity. And you need to know your plant available nutrient contents. Have I got enough nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, zinc? There's 16 of these you need, the plants need to grow. Have I got enough? Do I have a deficiency? Do I have inadequate nitrogen for good plant growth? What about my zinc? What about my iron? Or have I got too much? Particularly in terms of micronutrients, there's a chance you may have too much. And it depends on what you're adding to your soil. Let's talk about texture for just a minute. Why do you need to know your texture? Well, this is a textural triangle. How many of you have ever seen this before? Yeah, it's fairly common. All that is if you know the percent sand, silt, and clay in your soil, you can then define a textural class. So for example, you've got 30% clay. Clay moves this way. And you've got 40% sand, and you've got 30% silt. You're in the clay loam. That same amount of clay, though, if you only have 10% sand and 60% silt, that's a silty clay loam. What this triangle does is simply categorize different types of soils based on a commonality of properties. So soils that fall into this category have properties that we define as a clay soil. Sandy clay, silty clay, sandy clay loam, all kinds of names here. The percent sand increases as you go this way, so the sandy soils congregate over here. Silt soils increase in silt. Here's the silty soils. Here's the clay soils. The name of your soil type gives you an idea of the soil properties. Here's the thing, clay content strongly influences soil properties. You only need 20% clay for a soil to behave as a clayey soil. Take a look at the names. That's heavily, the word clay is showing up in these names. Clay heavily dominates. Well, what does that mean? What are the properties of a clayey soil? It's important to know your soil texture because soils dominated by clay are very different in properties than soils dominated by sand. And the intermediate soils have intermediate properties. For example, soils that have a lot of clay in them have really high water and nutrient holding capacities. They can hold a lot of water, they can hold a lot of nutrients, and much of this is available for the plants, so that's a good deal for the plants. The problem is clayey soils, if you have a lot of clay in your soil, you have a lot of small pores. Clay has small pores. Well, what that means is infiltration of water into your soil is very slow. Drainage of water through the soil is very slow. So you end up with aeration problems. You end up with it being slow to warm up in the spring. They're prone to crusting, they're prone to compaction, and they're prone to salinity buildup because water does not move well through that soil. Now, how many of you have clay soils? That's the norm. Any sandy soils? Am I the only one? Yeah, you've got. I moved from Fort Collins to Windsor about 12 years ago, and I'm now in a sandy soil. It's a whole different world. I've had to relearn how to manage my landscape. Sandy soils have low water and nutrient holding capacities. They just can't hold that much water or nutrients, so that stresses the plant. But they have huge pores, big pores. So they drain fast. That means they're not prone to aeration. They warm up fast in the spring. They don't tend to crust. Crusting is a clay thing. Sometimes they're prone to compaction, but not nearly to the extent of a clay soil. And you don't usually see salinity buildup in a sandy soil because it drains so well. So you do a soil test, it comes back and the word clay shows up in your soil texture. That means what you need to be thinking about are these issues. My soil is going to have slow infiltration, slow drainage. That's going to impact how I irrigate. Poorly aerated, that's a problem for your plants. You've got to be careful. You can compact the soil easily, and you need to watch out you don't build up the salt content of your soil. For me, now that I'm in a sandy soil landscape, my problems are low water and nutrient holding capacity. These problems are not any longer my major problems. My problem is how do I get this soil to hold enough water and nutrients to support my plants? This slide shows how texture influences water holding capacity. Water and air move through the soil in different ways. When water moves through the soil, it wants to coat all the particles, and then it fills these little pores. That's where water moves. Sand, or air, tends to fill the large pore spaces. It tends to reside in these big pores. So if you have a clayey soil with all those small pores, you have lots of this. You have lots of area to hold water, but you don't have enough of this. You don't have enough big pores to aerate your soil. The opposite holds for sandy soils, plenty of aeration potential, not enough of this, not enough of sites, small pores to hold the water. We have a lot of clayey soils. Low soil oxygen due to the lack of large pores is the most limiting factor for trees on the Front Range because of this situation. Clay soils, tiny pores, poorly aerated. Porosity strongly influences how water moves through your soil, and it has to do with the size of the pores. If you have sandy soil, predominantly large pores, gravity is the main force acting on that soil water. Water will be added, it tends to go straight down, very little lateral movement, and look how fast it's moving. In this example, within 15 minutes it's down a foot. In 40 minutes it's down 3 feet. In an hour it's past 4 feet. It moves fast and it moves down. Now, if you have a soil dominated by clay, two forces act on that water moving into a soil. Gravity moves it down, but capillary action moves it laterally. So look at the difference, how wide the water spreads in this clay soil and how slowly it moves. It took 4 hours to get it down 2 feet. In 40 minutes in the sandy soil, it was down 3 feet. Well, how water moves in your soil, what this looks like in your soil profile, and of course you can't see it, these are major factors influencing how you design irrigation and management in terms of things like proximity of drip lines to your plant. Put a plant right here, put a plant right here. This one the roots are going to be able to expand much better than here. It also you've got to be thinking about in your design and management, how fast can you add water into the soil? How fast will water go into your soil before it saturates the surface soil and runs off? How often should you add water to the soil? How deep will the water go? In this soil, you irrigate too long and the water is going to be down below your root zone. So the general rules of thumb in irrigating is on clay soils, water infrequently. You need to give that soil a chance to dry out and recharge the oxygen, and water thoroughly. Get that water down deeply. Sandy soils, you're going to have to water more frequently. If you water every 5 days in the hot summer on a sandy soil, your plants are not going to have any water after about day 2. And water with shorter sessions. You water 30 minutes, most of that water is wasted because it's gone down too far and the roots are up here and your water's down there. So why is proper irrigation so important? Well, obviously you waste your water if it's running off. You've spent your money, wasted the water, and your plants are still thirsty. Clay soils, I volunteered with the city of Fort Collins a couple summers ago and did irrigation audits. One of the things we were finding is people in these clay soils tend to water shallow, short period of time, and they like to water every day, water very frequently. Well, that's just the opposite of what you need to be doing. They tend to do that because clay soils can't absorb water into the soil very fast. So runoff starts pretty quickly on a clay soil. And instead of learning how to, or knowing that you can adapt to that, they just add it until it runs off, not much has gone in, and then they just add it again tomorrow. Well, here's the thing. What you do when you do that to a clay soil is you get this chronically wet surface soil. That acts as a barrier or a lid on oxygen from the air getting down into the soil and recharging that soil. So with time, the microbes are down here, they're doing their thing, they're using up oxygen. This soil starts becoming very low in oxygen. Well, the microbes shut down, the roots won't go there. Roots don't go into soil that's low in oxygen. Whether or not there's water in that soil, if it's low oxygen, roots won't go there. So you're condemning this poor plant to be a shallowly rooted plant in a chronically wet soil. It's not happy. It's not going to go down here and get nice deep rooting of, say, like your lawn grass until you can get oxygen down into that soil. This is unhealthy. This is not a healthy, happy soil. The plants and the microbes aren't too thrilled either. All right, let's move off of texture. Why do you need to know the pH and lime content of your soil? Well, pH is important. It influences nutrient availability. It influences the type of plants you can grow. It influences microbial activity. Different microorganisms live in different pH soils. The ratio of bacteria, fungi, actinomyces changes depending on the pH of your soil. All right, this is your typical pH scale. If your soil is a pH of 7, it's neutral. Equal amounts of acid and alkalinity. All right? If the number's low, it's an acidic soil. If the number's high, it's an alkaline soil. Here is what's generally accepted as the range in pH that's acceptable. Not ideal, but acceptable for most plants. Most plants will manage a pH of 6 to 7.5. There's the exceptions, the acid lovers. Blueberries and rhododendrons and azaleas, they want an acid soil. They're not going to be very happy over here, and they actually prefer very acid soils. Some of our Colorado soils have a near neutral pH from 6.8 to 7.3. This is your mountain soils and old garden or lawn soils in Old Town. 50, 60, 100 years of irrigating and adding amendments, their pH is a little bit lower. Here's the thing though, most front range soils are alkaline, pH 7 to 8.3, and many of our soils are outside of the sweet zone. They're highly alkaline. They're outside of this generally accepted range of pH that plants are the happiest. So we get this question a lot. I'm involved with the master gardeners and we hear this one all the time. How do I lower my pH? Sometimes it's just, I'm 7.8 pH, I want to get it down to closer to neutral. Many times people are asking, I want to grow a blueberry, I want to grow a rhododendron, an azalea. How do I take my 7.9 pH and get it down to 5? You don't. So here's the rule of thumb. If your pH is alkaline but low, in the low 7s, you can lower the pH by adding an acidifier such as sulfur only if there's no free lime in that soil. That's why you need to know your lime content. But here's the deal, our soils are well buffered. What that means is the chemistry of soils is such that it resists a change in pH. It's hard to change the pH even if you don't have any lime. It takes a lot of work and the results are usually temporary. So it just seems, one of the things we're trying to stress is maybe change your mindset. We don't live in Ohio. We don't have naturally acid soils, for the most part, up and down the Front Range. So instead of trying to grow an azalea, take a look at alkaline-tolerant plants. There's a bunch of gorgeous ones, and then I'm sure will be talked about later today. If you just have to grow that blueberry, you just have got to do it, you will not successfully change the pH of your soil enough to get it down to an acid level that blueberry is happy. Then think about a big pot, making an artificial acid soil, and grow your blueberry in the pot. Okay, here's the thing though. If you are have a soil that's strongly alkaline and it contains free lime, and all you need to do is drip a little vinegar on your soil. If it fizzes, you've got free lime. That's a predominant characteristic of our soils. It tends to keep the pH high. If you have free lime, you cannot lower the pH of your soil effectively by adding acidifiers. That lime will neutralize any and all acidifier you can ever add to that soil. So, you get your soil tested, it comes back and it says, you got a pH of 7.9 and you have very high lime. Well, you just simply use this as a red flag for your soil, for your landscape. Soils with high pH and high free lime, here are some things that happen in those soils. Iron chlorosis is common. You may also see deficiencies of phosphorus, zinc, and manganese. It's not that there's not enough of these nutrients in the soil. Our soils are loaded with iron and these nutrients. The deal is here with many of the nutrients, and these are the main ones, as the pH of the soil gets higher, the plant available form of that nutrient precipitates out. You've got lots of iron, but it's in a form at a high pH that the plant can't take up. The plant can't use the forms of these nutrients, much of it, at high pHs. So, you've got your bad news. You've got 7.8 pH and a very high lime. You know that your soil is going to be susceptible to iron chlorosis. Well, you need to start thinking about, if you have the opportunity to put a plant in, what plants have a high susceptibility to iron chlorosis? Well, you take a look at this, the fruit trees that are listed, the small fruits, the conifers, ornamental trees, deciduous trees, shrubs, everything on here is something that's very popular as a landscape plant. People want to grow these. Now, it doesn't mean you can't grow them. It means that growing them on this type of soil is going to take a lot more maintenance to grow these plants. You're probably not going to have the prize plant. It's not going to be the biggest, lushest, happiest, healthiest. It's going to be more susceptible to disease and it'll probably die young relative to the plant being in a place that it's happy. As an alternative, and this will be talked about today, think about selecting plants that aren't so susceptible to iron chlorosis and that are better adapted to our soils. Think about plants that are happy here. Instead of trying to force plants to live on this soil with this climate where they're just simply not well suited. And there are tons of fact sheets talking about xeriscaping, wildflowers, native plants, just a wealth of good information. All right, we're going to move on. We're going to talk about organic matter. Organic matter in the soil has a small living component and a large non-living component. And here's the thing to realize, a healthy soil is a living, breathing ecosystem. A healthy soil is just chock full of all kinds of organisms. It's loaded with organisms, ranging from microscopic, the fungi, the bacteria, the actinomycetes are the microorganisms. There's bigger critters there. There's the worms and ants and spiders and insects that you can see. There's even bigger creatures living in the soil, of course, the pocket gophers and prairie dogs and mice and ground squirrels. Many of the soil organisms living in the soil, have a direct influence on plant health. And I'm just going to focus on those, on some positive influences on plant health. There's all kinds of influences, but I'm going to focus on three really important ones. One is the decomposition of organic litter. All kinds of microorganisms and organisms are involved with that process. A plant dies, the roots are dead, the tops fall to the ground, a mouse dies. Living creatures die and become litter that then are decomposed in the soil. All kinds of organisms are involved with this. The benefit of breakdown of organic litter, while practically speaking we're not 200 feet deep in carcasses, but the other is, when you break down that litter, that decomposition process releases nutrients that are available for plants. Plants can't take up nutrients in that dead leaf. They can take up the nutrients only after that dead leaf is decomposed or begins to be decomposed. The other is the decomposition process ultimately forms soil humus, and that's a good guy in your soil. Here's another good guy thing that microorganisms do for the soil. They exude this sticky stuff. It's called glomalin. It's kind of like microbe poop. They exude it, and it sticks soil particles together to form aggregates. The process of aggregation is what makes pores in your soil. And if you don't have pores, you can't move water and air through your soil. Hugely beneficial to plants. And the third one is really fun. This is a plant root. This is fungal mycelia. And certain mycorrhizal fungi infect a plant root. And then they act as root extenders. These little mycelia go out. They increase the plant root systems 100 to 1,000%. They go out into the soil way past the root. They take up water, they take up nutrients, and they share. The plant then turns around and shares carbohydrates. So it's a mutually beneficial situation. This really decreases stress load on plants when those fungi are way out beyond the root, mining the soil for water and nutrients that the plant needs. That saying, feed and nurture the soil, and the soil will feed and nurture the plants, this is who you're feeding and nurturing, the living organisms in the soil. So conversely, if we are inadvertently managing poorly and creating an environment where these organisms are not thriving and not doing their jobs, your plants are going to be unhealthy too. Okay, you go get a soil test, you get an organic matter content back, watch my time here, and it will give it to you in percent organic matter. It will say you have 3%, 1%, 5%, 8% organic matter. Here's just the general rule of thumb. If the organic matter content is reported as 4% or higher, that's generally considered high. But it depends on what you're growing. You know, if you've got a veggie garden, those veggies are nutrient hogs. And they like a rich organic matter soil. You could build your organic matter up to 5 or 6%, and your veggies are going to be happy. But if you're trying to grow native xeric plants, this is probably too high. Native and xeric plants evolved in low organic matter soils. Our native plants did, because this is a semi-arid climate. You don't have high natural organic matter soils in this part of the world. They aren't evolved to take advantage, but weeds are. So if you're trying to grow a native or a xeric system of plants in a high organic matter situation, you may be ending up with weeds and undesirables pushing out your desirables. 2 to 3%, that's considered adequate, good, but it depends on what you're growing. Less than 2% is generally considered low organic matter. It's native here. Our soils, the shortgrass steppe, less than 1%. That's pretty common. But it depends on what you're growing. You know, the natives and xerics are probably just fine with this. Now, if you have a low organic matter and you've decided you're not going to add more for whatever reason, it doesn't mean you can't grow plants. It just means it's going to be higher maintenance again. The goal is to match the organic matter needs of the plants with the organic matter content of your soil, and to stay in a reasonable range, to not try to grow a plant that wants to be in a bog, for example, to not try to grow a plant that just loves high organic matter in a 1% organic matter soil. You need to know what your plant prefers, you need to know how far you can change your soil organic matter, and then you match them up. Why add organic matter? It improves aeration and drainage in the clay soils. It increases water and nutrient holding capacities in the sandy soils. You'll get some plant available nutrients, stabilize your pH, improves structure, tilth, the workability of your soil, and it feeds those microbes. Now, there are some differences in, what am I talking about with organic amendments? And organic amendments are not the same thing as organic fertilizers. Organic amendments are things like compost, biosolids, sphagnum peat, worm castings. When somebody says add organic matter to your soil, they're usually talking about this. Organic fertilizers are organic materials too. They just have a high concentration of nutrients. So this is stuff like the meals, the plant meals, alfalfa, soybean, cottonseed, corn gluten meals, animal meals, bone, blood, feather, guanos, fish meal, seaweed, rock powders. These are organic, well, the rock powders are not, but mainly organic fertilizers. They're materials with a concentration of nutrient. There's a major difference between these two materials. Organic amendments are not regulated by law. And this is a really important thing to know. No regs, no standards for bag products, some voluntary standards for bulk. They don't have to give you any analysis. They don't have to tell you what's in the bag other than this is steer manure, it's composted, it's pulverized, no weed season, it doesn't smell. That is not nearly enough information to know what you're putting on the soil. Here's the thing, animal composts and biosolids can be extremely salty. You have to use them with caution. And the bag isn't going to tell you how salty it is. If the product is designated a fertilizer, that's regulated by law. And these products have to tell you what's in the box. They have to guarantee some minimum percentage of the big nutrients anyway, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. What's this salt potential thing? You need to pay attention to the salt potential of a product before you put it on. And working with the soil test lab, we're finding that people pay a heavy price if they don't. Salt potential just doesn't mean that the salts are high, it just means they may be high. While biosolids, manures, animal-based composts, they have a high salt potential. Here's the thing, that's most of the products that are commercially available, and it makes sense. We have a lot of dairies and we have a lot of feedlots. And we have a lot of municipalities producing sewage sludge. So we're going to have mainly organic matter products for sale that are going to be these types of materials, and they have a high potential to be very salty. In contrast, plant-based composts have a low potential to be salty. You can't hardly find these. I found one bag product in the whole town, just one, and it was highly pricey. You can get it in bulk. I'm not going to go into composting today, but one of the best things you can ever do is learn to make your own compost. Plant-based compost that you make and control is the gold standard. You can't add anything better to your soil. Okay, there's a salt issue, a potentially high salt with these products that you're buying and wanting to add to your soil. So the question is, how much can I add? How much is safe to avoid a salinity problem? Well, here's Extension's recommendation. If you're going to add it once, or you're going to add it every year, for the first 3 years of annual applications, if it's plant-based compost, it has low salt potential, you can add 2 or 3 inches on the soil surface. You need to mix that into the top 6 to 8 inches of your soil. If it's an animal-based product and you don't know the salinity load, you better not add more than 1 inch of that material and mix it into the top 6 or 8 inches of the soil. And even then, you might push the salinity of your mix, your soil compost mix, over to something too salty. And that'll depend on if your original soil was already borderline salty, and it depends on just how seriously salty that product is. Now, if you're adding it annually, do this for 3 years. The recommendation is by the 4th year, cut this way back. And all along, if you're adding some kind of product every year, you need to be measuring the salt load of that soil, and you need to be looking at how high am I building up the organic matter. Because depending on your conditions, you may be in a soil situation where the decomposition rate is so fast that you're not building up the organic matter very fast. You may be in a situation where you're up there at 10% organic matter after a couple of years. Well, that's probably way too high for many of the plants you're trying to grow. If you're going to be adding amendment, it's a good idea to know the organic matter content of the soil each year and the salt load. What happens if you add too much organic matter? There's such a thing as too much of a good thing. You can end up with a serious salt buildup. You can end up with an enormous release of nitrogen way beyond what your plants need, way beyond what the microorganisms need. And much of that is potential polluter. You can get a big buildup of phosphorus. That's becoming a problem in the country. And my understanding is, but I don't know if how accurate this is, but there are states that are seriously considering not allowing phosphorus fertilizers to be going on to landscapes. When you overload organic matter, you can also end up with an imbalance of the nutrients in the soil. Soil nutrients are healthiest at specific ratios of how much potassium to calcium to magnesium. If you dump a whole bunch of potassium, for example, into the soil, and many animal-based products are loaded with potassium, and it has to do with what they eat, you mess with the plant's ability to take up calcium and magnesium. Even if there's a whole bunch of calcium and magnesium in the soil, and our soils are loaded with available calcium and magnesium, you overload with potassium, you mess up the plant's ability to take up something else, in this case calcium and magnesium. The whole issue too, when you've got a whole bunch of nutrient that you don't need, the plant doesn't need, will never need those amounts, the microbes don't need, you're setting yourself up for being a source of pollution. Okay, we're going to move to salinity. Let's talk about salinity. I mentioned it a little bit. So what happens if you've got too much salt in your soil? What does that do? Why does that matter? Well, the biggie is it reduces water uptake by plants. They actually dehydrate. Even if there's a lot of water in the soil, water starts moving from the plant out and into the soil. It's an osmotic potential thing. When there's too much salt in the soil, the plant cannot pull up water, even if there's plenty of water to be had. It will burn the roots, it restricts root growth, it will burn the margins of the leaves, it inhibits flowering, it messes with seed germination, it'll reduce your fruit and veggie yields. Salt injury then is of course more severe on a hot, dry day because there's less water in the soil on a hot, dry day, so your salt is concentrated. Here's the thing too, people don't think about. When your soil's too salty, that's a negative impact on most soil organisms. Just imagine a worm trying to live in a soil that's just had a potload of something salty dumped onto it. You know, it's true. If your organisms aren't real happy, your plants aren't going to be happy. And here's an interesting thing I hadn't realized until recently. With your fruits or your veggies, you can have as much as a 25% reduction in yield and not see a single indicator that your soil's too salty. Doesn't show up at all. You don't have any white crust on the soil, there's no burning of the leaves, but 25% reduction. Salt is a serious issue for plants. So how much is too much? Well, if you have your soil analyzed, what the lab does is talk about soil salinity in terms of something called electrical conductivity, or EC. And there's two kinds of units, millimoles per centimeter, decisiemens per meter. The units don't matter, they're interchangeable. What you're looking for is the number 2. If the EC of your soil is less than 2, that soil is defined as non-saline and you shouldn't have a negative impact on the growth of plants. If that number is higher than 2, the higher the number, the more saline your soil is, the more and more and more plants are killed or severely restricted by that salt load. So this is a good number to know. Here's the thing, most of our soils are not naturally saline, but by how we manage, by what we add, we're building up the salinity of many soils. Because here's the thing, we just talked about soil amendments such as manures and biosolids and compost made from them are very high in salt. So are many of these topsoils that you can buy. They're not regulated by law either. You can buy a stellar product, it's great topsoil. You can buy basement diggings with a bunch of raw manure mixed in and sold as topsoil. If you don't know the analysis of this soil, what we're finding at the soil test lab is over and over and over again, people bought a topsoil, or they bought a potting mix, or they bought a soil mix, they built a raised bed, and everything died. They tried to grow a veggie garden, everything died. The director of the soil test lab talked about having to serve as a witness, an expert witness at a big lawsuit in Denver a number of years ago. This guy built this palace of a house, spent $100,000 on his landscape, and this poor landscaper neglected to have any analysis done on the yards and yards and yards of topsoil he bought, and everything died. Everything died. And he was getting sued. Well, the salinity of the topsoil he bought was something like 12. Hugely high, and we are seeing numbers like that over and over and over again. These products are not regulated by law. Some of them are excellent, some of them are not. So be careful what you add to the soil if you don't know its analysis. Use them sparingly, monitor the salt levels. The other way we're salting up our soils is adding fertilizer when it's not needed. Inorganic fertilizers are salt, period. They provide a nutrient in the form of a salt. So if you're adding a little nitrogen just to kind of give a little advantage to that plant, and it doesn't need any, all you've done is salted up your soil a little bit, maybe a lot. So inorganic fertilizers, just pure salt. The slow release inorganic fertilizers, there's less of an impact on the salt because they don't dissolve all at once. And organic fertilizers generally have a lower salt index, but you still don't want to be over adding these. Okay, last one on the list, plant available nutrients. You need to know what your levels are. You need to know, do I have enough? If this one's deficient, how much should I add? If this one's too high, what do I do about it? And the best way to do that is to get your soil tested, to tell you whether or not you need to fertilize. It's a common practice for people to just add a little fertilizer, whether or not it's needed. Most of our soils, most of them by far, are not going to need any phosphorus, are not going to need any potassium. And we keep adding them with these complete fertilizers that have N, P, and K in them. We just keep building it and building it and building it and heading towards problems. We need to think about changing the mindset. What nutrients are deficient, and those are the ones I fix. Not just this add a bunch and don't worry about adding too much. Okay, what happens? You fertilize excessively, and all that means is you're adding more nutrient than the plants need and then the microbes are going to use. Well, you can end up with a pollution problem because that stuff isn't all going to just sit there. Nitrate moves with the water. Any excess nitrate that the plants don't need, the microbes don't need, moves right down with the groundwater, and it's heading towards the streams and it's heading towards the ocean. You'll salt up your soil, mess with the balances of nutrients, and with the micronutrients you can add so much that you're actually at a level that's toxic to plants. And we're finding that with some of the products that people are adding, a topsoil or a potting mix. Sometimes they're extremely high in micronutrients, so high that it's toxic to the plant. Okay, evaluation of your soil. Here's, any particular questions you have on how to soil sample or how often to sample or how many samples are fairly well covered here, and I'll be around to answer particular questions. Again, with the sample kits, these are nice. The lab likes you using these because people tend to give you a gallon of soil for the analysis or a 5-gallon bucket of soil, and that's a huge labor input for the lab to process all of that to representatively subsample. This is all you need for a routine soil test. So that's one of the reasons they like you to use these. The others is Ziploc bags, puncture, open, they're harder to store in the lab, it's just a practical thing. All the instructions you need, everything you need is in here. These are free. You just pay for the soil analysis when you send in the sample, or they'll even bill you. And just so you know, right now the routine soil test is $28. If you have like a potting soil, something you know is higher in organic matter, a potting mix or a manure or a compost, that's more expensive because you have to do more analyses, and then there's all kinds of specialty tests you can do if you want. Okay, I'm a 30-year soil scientist. My bias is numbers on soil. That's what I do. So obviously, I think this is very important. But if you know your basic numbers, you really can use this as a tool. Really, knowledge of the basic properties of your soil to a large degree determines how you ought to be managing that landscape. It's an important tool in your toolkit, but it's not the magic bullet. And I want to make a final point here. Soil testing isn't going to provide all the answers to your landscape problems. If your problem is you're a terrible irrigator, you overwater consistently, you underwater, or you're inconsistent, soil tests won't tell you that. It's not going to tell you if the main problem on your landscape is disease or insect damage or weeds or too much shade. You start out with this lovely bluegrass lawn with your new house, and in 15 years your trees are enormous, shading that bluegrass, and the bluegrass is looking kind of ratty. Bluegrass doesn't like shade. So you need to know, the soil test isn't going to tell you that that's the main problem with that bluegrass. It's not going to tell you if really the variety you have of, say, like your crabapple isn't a very good variety. There's other varieties that are better. Soil test isn't going to say whether or not your main problem is you're neglectful of your landscape. And it's not going to tell you whether or not your soil is compacted. Compaction is a #1 issue with our soils on landscapes because it gets so compact when we build the buildings. And we've got so many clay soils. With compaction, you get poor aeration and drainage, and that may be the #1 problem on your landscape, not a specific soil property. Okay, last slide, take-home points in terms of soil health. If you want a healthier soil, avoid excessive use of these products. They're concentrated, use them sparingly. I would argue if you're going to add a lot of anything, know the analysis. Either get it analyzed or have your dealer analyze the product. Change your mindset. Don't add something if you don't know what's in it. I mean, that's kind of common sense, and yet we do it all the time. We do it all the time. We drive a car and we don't know how it works. We tend to fertilize and amend our soils and we don't know what's in the box and we don't know what's in the package. We've got to get away from this mindset. If it's organic, it's always good, period. Not always. There's many products out there that are harmful. And if you don't know the analysis, you don't know that its EC is 25, you don't know that no matter how much of that product you add, you're going to salt up your soil. You don't know that it's so high in manganese that no matter how much you add, you're going to have a manganese problem. Here's the other thing we've got to get away from. If a little is good, more is better. If a little is good, more is more. More is excess. More is not a good idea. Add what you need. And in my mind, the best way is you get a soil test. It tells you what you need, and that's what you add. Now, I could do a whole class on soil testing because it's no magic thing. You know, most of the fertilizer recommendations are based off guesstimates from agriculture. I grew up in the soils departments of 2 universities. Well, they're in agronomy, they're not in horticulture. Most of the research done on soil methodology and soil testing and fertilizer recommendations are based on ag crops, corn, wheat, soybeans, this type of thing. But there is a reasonable transfer of that information for the landscape plants. And you are better off, I think, getting that recommendation than flying blind. Here's another thing. If you want a healthy soil, learn how to calculate fertilizer application rates. That throws a lot of people, and it's not too hard to do, but there's good information in the garden notes and in the fact sheets on how to calculate it, how to add it. If you need a pound of N per 1,000 square feet and you've got this bag of fertilizer, how do you translate 1 pound of N per 1,000 square feet to how much of this stuff you add to your soil? Bottom line too, I think last but not least, is learn how to irrigate properly for your particular soil, for your particular landscape. If we focus on not only hydrating the soil but keeping it well aerated, you're going to have a lot happier, healthier soil. Now I think, yeah, that's it. And if we have a few minutes, I'll answer questions. Otherwise.
But let me get into landscape design, water-wise landscape. This is one of my passions. It is really a fun topic to work with because there are no black and whites. It's all grays because there are so many factors that play into it. You know, when we talk about plants and their water use and the soils and all the things that play into it, it is a very, very complex topic, and it's one that I love to play with and teach about, okay? If you want the long version of this presentation, the 6-hour version, you can go to my website, which is www.cmg.colostate.edu. Click on Garden Notes, and Garden Notes 411, 412, 413 is the 30-page handout that I'm just pulling a few highlights from for today's class, okay? I try to look at that longer class and say, if I only have 45 minutes, what do I really want to say, okay? First off, design, landscape design is not the same discipline as gardening. People who are excellent gardeners may know nothing about design. And people who are excellent in design may know nothing about gardening, okay? And there are those who have expertise in both areas, but they are separate disciplines. So being a good gardener does not mean that you know principles of design. And how do most of us do landscape design? We simply look at a neighbor, we like what they did, so we copy it. And we may not know why it looks good or why it doesn't, okay? I want to basically focus on the 7 principles of water-wise landscaping. And I prefer to use the term water-wise landscaping than water-wise gardening because the 7 principles are about landscape design, not about gardening per se. The first one is plan and design for water conservation, beauty, and utility. The take-home message is it doesn't happen by accident. You can't be like my neighbor who is really into xeriscaping. I think I could sell him a dead plant if I labeled it xeric. And I say that because he's often come home with plants that were not too healthy, but he says, wow, but they're xeric, so I bought it, you know. And then he plunks them in with everything else in the yard, and he waters the heck out of the entire yard, and with all his xeric plants, he hasn't saved a single drop because he didn't design it to be water saving, and he overwaters everything. I'm going to talk more about that. We have a lot of press that talks about selecting plants for our climate, and that's not the take-home message. The take-home message is that you then group the plants based on their water needs. So this part of the yard has those plants that have a higher irrigation demand, and that part of the yard has the plants that have a lower irrigation demand. In other words, this part of the yard is not getting as much irrigation as that part. That is called hydrozoning, okay? And that is the take-home message, that the entire landscape does not have to be highly irrigated. We have sections that we have designed to be moderate or low irrigation in that. Water efficiently with appropriate irrigation methods is clearly the number one most important step of it. I'm going to talk more about that in just a bit. Creating practical turf and non-turf areas. Water-wise landscaping is not an anti-turf, but what it is selecting turf where the use of the property suggests its need, and selecting different types of turf based on the use. I'm going to come back and talk more about that, okay? Improving soils. Gene's already given you a phenomenal overview of soils, but wow, it is huge when it comes to water savings and the quality of your landscape. And as someone who's been in horticulture and teaching and diagnosing plants, I'm aware of it, but it really hit base for me a couple of years ago. I bought a new home out in Severance. It had been farmland, okay? So the soil was in okay shape to start with, okay? The builder had put in the front lawn, and it was more lawn than I wanted. So I improved the rest of the soil in the rest of the yard. Yeah, I spent over $1,000 on soil amendments, buying the plant-based stuff that was not high in salts, and wow, that's the best investment I've ever made in my landscape. And then I took part of the front yard with a sod cutter, because I didn't need that much lawn, moved that to the backyard. Within 3 weeks of being moved, the back lawn was outperforming the front lawn. The back lawn that had improved soils, I irrigate once a week. I fertilize it lightly twice a year, and it is as perfect of a lawn as I need. The front lawn on that compacted soil, without the amendments, doesn't have a really deep rooting depth, has a hard time stretching into twice a week irrigation in the summer heat. Fertilizer always looks like it could use a little bit more because it just doesn't have the root system that it needs to take it up what it really wants. And I have a constant problem with a thatch layer, which is a common development when you put sod over a non-improved soil. So it's amazing the black and white differences in it. I'm really tempted to take a sod cutter, cut up the front lawn, improve the soil. Why, that would be one heck of a work day. It would be, in the long run, the best, easiest way to deal with my front lawn. Mulching to reduce evaporation. Wow, I am big on mulching. I'm big on mulching because I don't like to weed. And years ago, when I had a TV show with KSL Television in Salt Lake, I had a bet with my producer that if they ever found a weed in my yard more than an inch tall, they could show it. And in the 8 years I had a garden show with him, they never showed a weed. And I averaged about 15 minutes a week weeding because it was all mulched, so I didn't have a weed problem to start with. As far as irrigation, water savings, it is huge. They estimate that a mulch will reduce your water need about 50%. In California, when they were in some really long-term drought where the kids were taught the song about flushing toilets, if it's yellow, let it mellow. If it's brown, flush it down. A lot of cities were going around and giving homeowners that had mulched flower beds tickets, claiming they must be sneaking out at night mulching the flower beds or watering the flower beds. No, they weren't sneaking out at night. With the mulch, the water need was less, and the plants did a lot better with less irrigation. Maintaining with good horticultural practices. It is estimated by the experts who do landscape maintenance that 90% of our problems come from design failures. Things that could have been addressed, things that should have been addressed in the landscape design. So when I'm talking about these 7 principles of water-wise landscaping, they all directly or indirectly go back to the design process, not the gardening process, but the design. I want to go back and expand on a few of these principles briefly. Okay, let's start with planning and design for water conservation, beauty, and utility. This is an amazing business property here. It is a wedding chapel. Okay, built by the son as his business. Mom's business is she is a world-class artist, and her garden is what she paints. And it is a phenomenal landscape of plant materials around the wedding chapel. It did not happen by accident, okay? It was meticulously planned. They started basically with a hillside and did a little bit of terracing, a lot of planning about where buildings are, where different gardens are, about the flow of people. Since it's a commercial site, can we accommodate a small intimate wedding? How do we accommodate a large wedding? How do we accommodate a retreat? They have a lot of corporate retreats in the property. And again, it was very meticulously planned. It looks like a design that requires a lot of water, just because of the gorgeous plants there. And it is actually a very xeric design because they have very limited water supply for that, okay? Design is a process. It is more than just plucking down some plants. And let's get real. How do most of us do landscaping? We go to the nursery, we buy a plant that we like, we take it home, we say, okay, where should I stick it? Well, we'll stick it here, you know? Oh, I like that tree. Where will I put it? Well, there's a bare spot, you know? Most of us landscape with the buy and plunk. And I'll admit, I do too. I was at Fort Collins Nursery a couple of years ago, found this peach tree that has maroon red leaves. I fell in love with it. I kept walking by it. It was not on my design. I had to redo a little bit of design to fit it in. In fact, the owner of Fort Collins was laughing and says, well, David, how many times are you going to walk by that plant? I know you're going to buy it. You know, we all buy and plunk, but that's the exception to the rule, not the normal way that we do landscape design. Most gardeners know a little bit about the design. If you really want to be water-wise, study more about design, fill in the dots, because landscape design is a process. And what about those of you that have an existing landscape that aren't starting from scratch? It's still a process, because is your yard going to evolve? Is it going to look different in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? Then you need to have the process to help it evolve into being water-wise. If you want to walk the talk of being water-wise, it is a process. The process is about creating practical and pleasing outdoor space, okay? Practical and pleasing. Wow, there is an interesting topic that's different for each of us. What's practical for me may not be what's practical for you, okay? I love to garden, okay? I love to start the day by spending a few minutes out in the yard, looking at what needs to be done, pruning the roses, pulling a weed, whatever, okay? My neighbor doesn't work that way, okay? What's practical for him is absolute minimal maintenance on Saturday morning before he goes to play golf, okay? So what's practical is a moving target. What's practical for you? In a business setting, what's practical can be more complex than even in the home setting. How about what's pleasing? Is that a moving target? Oh, it really is. When I was with the University of Minnesota a few years ago before coming to Colorado State, we were involved in a study where we were looking at native plants, okay? And we were showing people designs that were basically native plants in a naturalized setting. And it was interesting how some people saw them just as a weed patch. And how when we would say, well, this is a native garden, some would change their attitude. It suddenly became gorgeous. You know, pleasing is a moving target, and it will be different for each of us. It is about what you want and need from the landscape. This is a world-class restaurant that I love to go to when I feel very rich, actually when someone else is buying dinner, because you're paying $100 plus per person to eat there. You make your reservations at least 6 months in advance, and your reservation not only includes the time you're going to be seated, the time you enter the property, because there's 2 acres of gardens that you are invited to visit, to enjoy before your dinner time. So what do you want and need in your business? That is part of the design process. This is a B&B that I found absolutely amazing. They have 6 acres of gardens because their market is don't just come for the night, come for the week, bring your book, you know, just basically kick back and enjoy life. And the gardens are phenomenal, but this is behind the owner's home. They didn't want it open to the public. They didn't want the public to feel like, you know, they could go there. And so this is a lawn that is not grass, but it's gazanias. You know, very different approach with this mass planting of gazanias. This is the lodge of that B&B. And out one side of the lodge, this is the view. And out the other side of the lodge, this is the view. So in your business, what do you want and need from the landscape? And that all depends on your business, okay? But what do you want and need? And is it inviting to people or is it not? A few years ago, I was working with one of the large apartment complexes here in town, and they made the comment that they have a lot of walk-in traffic off the street in the wintertime, but not much in the summertime. And they don't cater to CSU students, so you know their need, their demand should be fairly consistent around the season. And I said, well, that's easy for me to explain. In the summertime, your dry lawns don't look inviting. If you're trying to bring people in, that this is a cool place to live, the dry lawn says it's not inviting. Research says dry lawns say you're not friendly. You know, interesting for that particular business, okay? This is the lunchroom for a corporate property. And I thought I can understand why this corporate is one of the top companies in the world for new ideas. Because you're getting out of the lunchroom into nature. Their whole corporate center is designed to stimulate the mind on a out of the traditional box scenario. What do you want and need? This is Souk Harbor House. This is considered one of the top 10 restaurants and resorts in North America. They specialize in the use of herbs, and every plate that comes to your table is decorated with edible flowers that comes from their garden. So what do they need in their design? Their design is all around what they use in their kitchen. And this is the view if you simply turn around and take a shot from the other direction. So if I were to ask for your business, what do you want and need in a landscape? It has huge implications as far as advertising what you are and what you do. One of the real trends in design is what we call these verticals to create space. They are not a visual block, okay? The visual blocks are kind of out of style right now, but they define and create space. A phenomenal way of creating space in a business setting. I love this picture. This is from Northern Colorado Water Conservancy District. To me, it's a really great example of what they call the Colorado High Plains. Okay, this is down at Berthoud, and it's open to the public to go see. Simply a high plains type of landscape. as we look at the process, it also involves the time and dollars that you want to invest. And I realize that this is a home, but to me it's a great example of someone who did not want to put much in time into maintaining, and a great example of how they did not spend much in dollars in that landscape, and a great design about how they really didn't meet their needs. Okay? Because this lawn's going to have to be mowed every week. And I suspect the homeowner spends more time fretting about, oh, I got to go mow the lawn, than the 5 minutes it actually takes to do it. So what do you want to invest in time? What do you want to invest in dollars is part of that process. So the process is far more than plunking down. And again, if you want the long version of the process, I'm not going to go into the process today because of time. My 30-page handout on the website goes through the steps of a simple process. Okay? Let's talk about watering efficiently. Okay? Wow, of all the principles of water-wise gardening, this is the most important. I had a neighbor when I lived here in Fort Collins who was very proud of their landscape that had been done, designed and installed by a very renowned landscape designer. Okay? And yet they didn't save any water. They used 3 times the amount of water that I did on my standard landscape. How do I know? Gladys Kravitz here had been out measuring their water. Okay? 3 times because of their irrigation management. In fact, I was over there several times working on problems with their xeric plants that weren't doing well because they were being so overwatered. This becomes a huge issue on a community-wide basis when we have a water shortage. Okay? On a community-wide basis, we use twice the amount of water for landscape irrigation as what our plants actually need. Wow. If we did a better job of irrigating, our water crisis in Colorado would be a whole different scenario than what we currently have. This comes back from the design, from the maintenance, and the management. Irrigation efficiency has the greatest water-saving potential of all the principles of water-wise landscaping, and if you don't get this one right, it really doesn't matter what else you do. You're not walking the talk, okay? I'm big on drip irrigation because when you take drip irrigation with a mulch, you're going to cut water use by 50%, okay? And so I love it for the flower beds. I love it for the vegetable garden, small fruit. There is new underground drip for lawns. The original underground drip for lawns had a lot of problems. It's been supposedly improved with engineering. The jury's still out as to whether the underground drip for lawns is really good or just expensive. But for flower beds, it is phenomenal. 75% of my yard is in drip irrigation, and my water bill changes so little from summer to winter, I really don't notice the change. I have a friend who spends over $3,000 a month on water in the summer for their yard. You know, wow, I'm big on drip. Now, one of the take-home messages about drip is it is not an install it, walk away and forget it type of system. It is not a low-maintenance system. Here we have really good quality city water if that's what you're using in the drip. I have fullers on mine, and I still find occasionally I will find a head that is plugged, a dripper that is plugged for some reason, or a pop in the system where a line has come loose or something. I have worked with one of the largest apartment complexes in the city, and it's kind of a joke about as we walk around the property, which we do every couple of months, and just talk about what's happening, that, oh, David's always talking about the drip. The drip was installed 10 years ago, has never been looked at since. We'll be walking around, I say, well, I think you got a problem with the drip in that bed. How do you know that? You just walk by it. Because I could see that crabapple tree has phytophthora root rot because of the color of the bark. You didn't even look at the roots. The color of the bark told me it had phytophthora root rot, which says that has probably a break in the line, and it's putting out too much water. And this bed and that bed and that bed, you better check and see if the drip is running. Well, how do you suspect that there is a problem with the drip? Because it is July and your trees are showing fall color. You know? And the first thing I want to know to diagnose why we're showing fall color is what's happened to the drip system. And I've gone back and they didn't check the drip, and then it was, well, you've got dead trees here, dead trees there, dead trees there. Well, they're under drip. Well, is the drip working? Drip is not an install it and forget it system, okay? If you're working in scenarios where you have sprinkler irrigation, such as a lawn, there are 3 factors that have to come together. You got to start with a design that is efficient. And do not assume that the low bid sprinkler install was designed to be efficient. The low bid sprinkler install was designed to be low bid. And the amount of water it uses to cover the area, because in low bid, you're going to have areas that get more water and areas that get less water. And what do you have to do to keep everything green? Water everything to the amount that the area that gets less water is, okay? So the low bid design was not designed to be efficient. There are standards about how a sprinkler should be installed that are not necessarily followed, okay? And again, there's details in my handout. Maintenance. Wow, it's amazing how we don't maintain our systems. Wouldn't you love to be my neighbor? I had a neighbor who had a sprinkler head that was malfunctioning, okay? Now, malfunctioning heads don't always mean that they're just totally not doing anything. They just were not putting it out in an even pattern, which is very hard to observe, okay? But he had a dry spot on this head. And he upped the water. He upped and upped. He kept turning the timer up. He was watering 6 hours a day, 7 days a week, and still had a dry spot. Wow, he pumped a lot of city water down the gutter, okay? That's maintenance. Maintaining, fixing those problems as they have to be maintained. Management basically comes down to how many minutes, how often, and that goes back to Gene's talk about are you on a sand or a clay, okay? And that again is a whole nother class. And if you really want to make that slick and easy, ET controllers have brains to take in the weather data, and they can measure that and do it all for you, okay? And I think we'll hear more about that in the next presentation. But all 3 of those, design, maintenance, and management, are critical to be water-wise in your sprinkler, and each of those are a totally separate class. Moving on to this concept of hydrozoning, selecting plants appropriate to our climate, which we've had a lot of press on. Wow, we've had a lot of press on in the last 20 years. But it's not just about selecting plants. It's about grouping them by their water needs and then actually watering them according to the group. This is a huge. A few years ago, I was given the challenge to say, you know, we've been talking water-wise, we've been talking xeriscaping as a community for over 20 years. And yet we really haven't walked the talk. We really haven't, as a community, and I'm saying the state of Colorado residents, really have not significantly reduced the amount of water used in landscaping. I was given the challenge to, as an educator, why? And I started looking at the messages and attitudes and understanding. It was because we don't quite get this concept of hydrozoning. It is essential to walking the talk, okay? And it's not a gardening principle, it is a design principle, okay? So I'm going to do some illustrations. I'm going to use a home scenario versus a commercial setting, because a home scenario puts us all on kind of an even playing field. And you all have a home, I assume you can follow that. Commercial settings are all over the board about what we're trying to do with the landscape. When we're talking about hydrozoning, we may have zones that have routine irrigation. They may be watered 2-3 times a week, depending on what's there, and your soil type, sand or clay. We may have zones that have reduced irrigation. Okay? They may be watered once a week, maybe every 10 days, maybe every 14 days, depending again what is in there as far as plant material and what your soil type is. We may have zones that have limited irrigation, where they are watered basically only during the dry spell, when Mother Nature doesn't do some irrigating for us. And then we may have zones that are non-irrigated, okay? They are intentionally not irrigated. And hydrozoning is saying, I would expect to find a variation in the landscape. And where does the typical Colorado landscape come out? Most landscapes, the entire design is routine irrigation. We have a habit of thinking high input Kentucky bluegrass covers everything that doesn't have a flower or shrub here and there. Okay? Hydrozoning is walking the talk, recognizing that we have a lot of options. And it goes back to the design, goes back to what do I need to achieve in this landscape. So I may have lawn areas that have routine irrigation. That would be the football field, the soccer field, the baseball field that has a lot of traffic on it. It would be unlikely that a home landscape needs the routine irrigation on the lawn because you don't have the wear and tear. Okay? Reduced irrigation for a lawn is going to irrigate at about 80% ET. It will look just as nice as 100% ET, okay? But it won't take as much wear and tear. The only wear and tear that my lawn gets is me mowing it, okay? Unless I have a party. So it doesn't get a lot of wear and tear. Minimal irrigation lawns. Some examples of a couple of companies here in Fort Collins that are phenomenal at understanding this is Hewlett-Packard, HP on Harmony Road, and Anheuser-Busch Brewery. In their high-use areas, up by the office buildings at what Anheuser-Busch calls the Visitor Center, where you go see the Clydesdales, you're going to have as about a perfect of a bluegrass lawn as you could possibly grow in Fort Collins, because it is a high-use area, okay? The rest of the property is minimal irrigation. And I love to take my senior class out to the brewery, and we look at the rest of the property, and my students say, oh my goodness, don't they know how to grow grass here? What's the objective? To look green from the freeway at 75 miles an hour. It doesn't take a lot of water, it doesn't take a lot of fertilizer to look green from the freeway at 75 miles an hour. So it's not a high input lawn, it is a minimal input lawn, a phenomenal illustration of matching the lawn with the actual use of the property. At HP again, they have high input bluegrass up by the buildings where people are going in and out, okay? Because green creates friendliness, okay? The rest of the property is managed just above being dry, okay? Again, they're matching the lawn to the actual property use. When we talk about flowers and shrubs, wow, they're all over the board about their water needs. Do not assume that Kentucky bluegrass is a water guzzler and the trees, shrubs, and flowers all use less water. Kentucky bluegrass on its actual water demand is somewhat middle class. And so some trees, shrubs, and flowers needs more water than Kentucky bluegrass and some needs less. And so if we were grouping them by water need, again, we would may have areas that have routine irrigation, areas that have reduced irrigation, areas that have limited irrigation. My shrubs, flower beds around my yard are on reduced irrigation, watered about every 10 to 14 days, depending on temperature. And again, my water bill changes so little from spring to summer, it's insignificant for me. Non-irrigated areas. Wow, if there is no landscape function there, why are we watering it? I think a great example is sides of a home. If there's no landscape use for that space other than it's space between you and the neighbor's house, why are we irrigating it? It's walking the talk, okay? A few quick slides to look at how this may apply. Again, I'm going to do a home scenario because it kind of levels a playing field. The blue would indicate routine irrigation, the green reduced irrigation, limited and non. Maybe I have a reduced irrigated lawn, because a home lawn just rarely would justify a high input. Maybe I have some flowers here that require that routine irrigation. Maybe I have a section here that is on limited irrigation, plant materials that will do fine only being watered when we have dry spells. So that would be an example of hydrozoning. Now, I don't mean that the bed is necessarily that exact shape. That's simply the way into the design process we identify that hydrozone. Maybe we go to a larger spot where we have limited irrigation. Maybe we have a section that has a reduced irrigation, maybe some sections that have routine irrigation. Again, we're trying to say is different sections of the yard have different amounts of water that they will receive. Maybe the property is non-irrigated with some limited irrigation in the high-use areas. Point we're making, if we want to walk the talk of being water-wise, the entire landscape is not watered every Wednesday and Saturday because it's our turn. It is watered based on the plant materials that are in there and the use of the property. Okay? So here would be some other examples of that. Maybe I have a patio, a lawn, vegetable garden, flower beds. But maybe that flower bed doesn't adequately define zones. Maybe I have flower beds that have routine irrigation in one section, flower beds that have reduced irrigation in another section, flower beds that have limited irrigation in a third. And why can't I mix them? Because if I mix them, everything gets watered like the first. And I don't save water. And those plants that are truly xeric, that don't like the heavy water, probably won't do well, again, in that heavy water situation. So here's another scenario. The flower beds may be more clearly defined as various zones. And why don't I mix them? I'm on drip. Why don't I put a dripper that has 1 gallon over here, a half gallon over here, and 2 gallon over there? Because that's not truly reflecting the plant needs. The half-gallon dripper is going to wet a spot yay big. The 1-gallon dripper is going to wet a spot yay big. The 2-gallon dripper is going to wet a spot yay big. Does it mean the xeric plant has a small root system and the water-loving plant has a big root system? That's not accurate. So I have different zones that I can water to different amounts. That is hydrozoning. That is walking the talk. Okay? Again, different scenarios. Quickly talking about creating practical turf areas. Again, water-wise landscaping is not anti-turf. It's about matching the turf to the use of the property. Like I mentioned, Hewlett-Packard, high input turf in the people area, low input turf on the rest of the property. Okay? Quick comparison of the water use of Kentucky bluegrass and other popular turf options. If I look at Kentucky bluegrass, and we're going to call it ET. ET is an actual measurement of the amount of water that bluegrass needs. In our climate, it needs 34 inches of rain and irrigation per season. And where's the typical home lawn being watered at? About 60. Okay? So that would be the high input turf that will take all the best wear and tear. I could go to the more drought-tolerant cultivars and reduce my ET to about 75%. I could cut to about 80% ET, giving 28 inches versus 36, or in reality, 28 inches versus the average of 60. And I couldn't tell the difference from this lawn and the 60-inch other than my lawn won't take as much wear and tear. Do you have a lot of wear and tear? Okay? I could go to tall fescue, which is often touted as drought tolerant because it has a deeper root system, but actual water use is very similar to bluegrass. So it's a misnomer that is a water saver. Okay? I could go to 60% ET, given that bluegrass or tall fescue about 20 inches a year. The grass will be thinner. Won't be as thick. Weeds will move in. So I'm going to have to manage weeds another way. But it will still be green. Okay? I could go to summer dormant Kentucky bluegrass. 14 inches. Not watered in the summer, watered in the spring and fall. When my dad got 90, he said, I don't think I want my half-acre vegetable garden anymore. Yeah, Dad, I don't think you need it. Most of your friends are dead. You don't have anybody to give the produce to. Okay? So we said, let's put it into grass. And I said, let's put it into summer dormant Kentucky bluegrass. You know? He says, nah, it's got to be green. How about you? Could you be summer dormant? What's the use of the property? Okay? How about buffalo grass? If you're going to have it green in the summer, it's got to have 17 inches. These are the three most commonly used turf types in Colorado. There's a lot of options. There's a lot of options beyond the high input Kentucky bluegrass that we typically give 60 inches to. Okay? And again, water-wise landscaping is not anti-turf. This is a corporate property. This is where the bosses sit to think. And it is amazing what they come up with. They consider this one of the most valuable pieces of property on their entire campus because the concepts that saved millions of dollars came around that table. Turf creates a people space. Well, my time is up. It's just fun to be here. Again, if you want more details on water-wise landscaping, please go to my website. Thank you very much.
Okay, I feel like I'm in the spotlight.
Yeah.
I guess that's true.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. All right, so I'm glad to be here today. Two great presentations preceding me. Hopefully I can live up to what they've already started here. But I think both of them are a great lead into the irrigation part of the presentation. Dr. Reeder talked about soils, and David talked about xeriscape and planting and a little bit about irrigation. And all these things kind of all work together to make the landscape work. Let's see, here this goes. Okay, so when we talk about irrigation systems and managing water, there's a lot of things that are involved in that process. So there's a lot of inputs that come into managing a landscape. So we have management, maintenance policies that sometimes in public entities, parks departments and so forth, they have policy-driven agendas sometimes. There's energy involved, there's staffing to take maintenance staff and management staff, and then there's water that's all kind of comes together to make these systems work. So the goals and challenges often are to meet the needs of a landscape or to meet the needs of the community or the user group, whatever it may be, whether it's a park, whether it's a corporate facility. David showed some really nice properties and talked about, what did the user want out of those. So this is what it comes down to. Are we developing or maintaining parks, trails, open space, recreational areas, or is it our front yard? We often, as public agencies, they want to demonstrate the wise use of resources. As businesses and public agencies as well, we want to save water, use staff efficiently, save energy, and be overall efficient in what we do. And then we all have available budgets, whether we're a city or a homeowner. We have budgets that kind of drive what we do. So the benefits of smart water management really are, there's many of them. We heard a lot of them in terms of landscape health of plants, health of soils, and also in reducing overall costs. In order to do these and to work within available budgets and resources, we need to kind of have an idea how much water we're using and reduce the overall cost due to water usage. So when we talk about water-wise management of irrigation systems, it really comes down, it's the efficient delivery of water to plant material in correct amounts and at the right time to promote the optimal health of the plant materials. So I think, David talked about hydrozoning. That's probably one of the most important things, is to get a proper design that delivers the right amount of water to the specific plant materials. Correct pressure is really key in making that happen as well. If you have a system that has low pressure, it's not going to deliver water as intended by the equipment. That's where we often see dry spots in landscape. A system is typically, you have a head layout and spacing that's dependent upon a certain pressure range. And when that pressure isn't available, then it falls short. If you ever go on to Google Earth and look around at sports fields, this is the kind of thing irrigation geeks like us do. Okay, so you go around and look at sports fields and you see these kind of donut patterns. And it's a telltale sign of often poor pressure or inefficient head layout. We have an embassy project in New Delhi that we're working on, and they tried to tell us that the existing part of the site, there's a grass area that's all watered by hand. And they do those kind of things in India. We went to Google Earth and we looked at it and we could see these donuts on the fields. And so we knew right then that they have some kind of a system in place that's not running terribly efficiently. So proper configuration of the system, proper management of the control systems and of the overall system, and then proper maintenance. Because once a system falls into disrepair, then you have problems with coverage. So when we talk about smart, we're going to talk about some smart technologies and what that means and what some of those are. And so wise management is not dependent on the use of the smart technologies. They're really just a tool. So the smart technologies facilitate wise management. So we need to be careful at some of the sales pitches we hear that, put in this controller, it's an ET controller or whatever, and it's going to solve your problems. Well, it won't if you have an inefficient system and if you configure it poorly. Tony talked about Xeriscape, and I won't dwell on these things, but I hear people often talk about, this really drives me crazy, they say Xeriscape. I'm going to do a Xeriscape and just put rock in my yard. Well, okay, that's a Xeriscape. Can't argue with that. But and I think David talked very, very well about what Xeriscape is and how that works into the landscape. So there's many parts to an irrigation system, and they're kind of all important, and all these things need to work together. And they're not only just parts, but some of them is the process it takes to bring all those parts together correctly to meet the needs of the landscape. So, the number one thing is to look at the site, analyze the site, whether it's an existing site or it's a new design or whatever it is, and what are the needs of that site, how is it going to be used, and plan out the system so that it can then address the specific needs of the plants. We need to look at the plant, water and soil relationships. As Dr. Reeder mentioned, the soil test is probably one of the most important things, not just for the plant, not just for the soil itself, but when it comes to irrigation design, understanding what those soil types are is very critical. So another thing we do is often look at what's the water demand going to be. We've got to get water somehow, and so with larger projects that we work on often, a critical part of that up front is to figure out, how much water is this landscape going to require, and so we have some pretty good ways. There's some methods of determining that, of calculating based on the plant material that's going to be used, and so we can properly develop a water supply. And that might mean, just getting the right cap size, getting the right pipe size, and understanding what the limitations of that water supply are. Often, in the example of many commercial properties or homes, we have a determined supply available. So then we have to design a system that will operate within the limitations of that available water flow rate and pressure. And on bigger projects, sometimes we have the luxury of saying, okay, we need this much water. Let's design a pumping station or a pond or a well or whatever that may be to meet those needs. Another important thing as well when you talk about salinity is if you're using water sources that are other than, like the city water supply is, what's the salinity level in that water? A big thing nowadays is to use treated effluent water, treated sewage water. A lot of cities are starting to use this, what they call reclaimed water, for irrigation of park spaces and so forth. And some cities are even making it available to residents. And so it's important to realize that often that water can have the potential of high salinity levels that we need to understand. So proper design of hydrozones, I think David really addressed that very well. Hydrozones are, take a look at the specific plant types and not only the plant type, but is it in a sunny area or a shady area? Is it on a slope? Is it in an area that's susceptible to a lot of wind or reflected heat or whatever that might be, so that we can then tailor the system to meet the specific needs of the plants. So then comes the selection of the proper equipment, and which means things, sprinkler heads, spray heads, rotor heads, rotator heads are kind of the new thing now. And these all have their specific place where they are appropriate. And also that includes drip irrigation and bubblers or whatever it might be to meet the needs of those of the plants. And then proper design of the system means that we have proper hydraulics so that we get proper pressure to the system. And then control systems that meet the needs of the user and, well, of the system, the landscape, but also the user. We get involved in a lot of large projects where the user comes in and says, we've got to be highly efficient. We want a ET-based system or a central control system. And we design that in to the system and so that they have all this capability, but often they don't have anybody that's going to manage that. They don't have the ability to really make use of that system. So often it would have been money better spent in some other part of the project and put in a simpler controller that they understand instead of just a really expensive Cadillac sitting there that's not really being used. So then water requirements, understanding the water requirements of the landscape and then adjusting the control system to meet those water requirements. We talk about hydrozoning. It doesn't do any good to hydrozone it and use different zones for different plant material if you don't then go in and schedule those differently to water different number of days per week or different durations based on the plant materials and the soil types. And then one of the, I keep saying most important things. All these things are important, okay? So proper ongoing maintenance and adjustments. So if if a head pops off and you don't fix it and it runs down the gutter, you're going to waste a lot of water, even if you have all these other things in place. So system planning, we look at, what type of site is it? What's the use level? What's the water supply? How's it going to get there? Is it new or existing? Are we adding on to an existing system? Do we need to understand what that existing system is? How much irrigation is required, which is driven by the use areas and the plants. So, we have the different use areas. I think David talked about, is it a high use area, turf, for example, that needs more water than a low use area. And then establishment only. A big thing now, of course, is to use native plant materials, native grasses. So a lot of big park sites, instead of doing bluegrass everywhere, will design with bluegrass in the sports field, maybe in the areas surrounding it, And then beyond those real use areas, they want to use kind of more native grasses that often don't really need much irrigation. And over the long term, maybe don't need any irrigation, but it's often important to get those established. If they don't get properly established, the weeds kind of come in and choke them out, and they're typically the owners aren't happy with them. It might take several years for those to finally grow in, and that process can often be sped up if we have some establishment irrigation to help get them going. So that's something to figure in as well. Some sites get very complex. They might have interior spaces, water features kind of mingled with them. And so there's a lot of planning involved in more complex type projects. Okay, so water supply. We get involved in developing all types of water supplies for the landscape, from well systems that feed into ponds that we then pump out of, raw water delivery through a ditch, or even just a municipal type water supply connection. The water demand analysis will often look at the site and kind of look at the different use areas. This is kind of a simplistic, it doesn't break it down as much as we often do. This is just kind of a analysis that was done for a veterans cemetery that we worked on, looking at the water demand needs in different parts of the site. Because of water laws to do with how much water they could use out of each well. So we can calculate, what these amounts of water would be. Okay, so when we talk about hydrozones and system zoning, we need to look at what kind of plants they are, where are they located, what's the spacing and density, what are special maintenance issues, what kind of exposure does it have? As I talked about before, we kind of went through some of these things, but this is really the key to having a system that can operate efficiently. It doesn't guarantee it's going to operate efficiently, but it makes it, if you design a system that kind of addresses the different hydrozones, if it's configured properly and managed properly, it can then operate very efficiently. But I want to stress, if it's not, then you really didn't accomplish anything. So it's really very critical that when a lot of work goes into designing a system and making it all work, that it's then managed correctly. So the selection of equipment, when we talk about equipment selection and meeting the needs of the plants and the soils, often we talk about precip rates. So precipitation rate, which means how fast is that water being applied to the landscape. And if it's applied too quickly, say on a high clay soil with a slope on it, it's often going to run off. So that needs to be applied at a slower rate so that it can infiltrate. If it's a sandy area, it might need more frequent irrigation and it might not have as much tendency to run off. Density of plant material can make a difference on how much water is required, exposures. So really just the appropriate equipment for the type of plant and the area is really what comes down, what we want to get from this. So let's talk a little bit about smart technologies. So on the tables back here, there's several of these type of smart controllers on display. And they vary. There's different methodologies of smart controllers. The main one probably being ET-based type products. There's also ones that measure soil moisture levels. And these are available in kind of just a standalone controller that you replace the whole controller. There's solutions to add-on devices you can add to an existing controller to give it some additional smarts. I think these are to meet the varying budgets of different users. There's different weather collection devices. There's ET gauges. I think there's one back here that just measures the the various hydrologic data needed to develop the evapotranspiration rate number. David talked about ET as a measurement of how much water is required. So that stands for evapotranspiration, and that's derived, there's a formula to calculate that number based on various factors such as temperature, relative humidity, solar radiation. Anyway, there's several factors that are brought into that. So by measuring the weather data, we can then calculate that. And some of these devices, it's done in different ways. You can use a full-blown weather station or some of these simpler devices that are quite effective but not as costly. So we talk about moisture sensing. Really what we're trying to do is maintain a moisture level in the soil. And using the ET-based devices, you're kind of estimating how much water you're going to need to put on to replace what's left, so that you can maintain a certain moisture level. When you use the soil moisture sensors, you're actually looking at what actually is the level of moisture. There's been varied success with different devices. I think there's now systems and sensors available that are very reliable and work very well. But it's critical that they're implemented correctly, installed correctly, in the correct locations and so forth in order for them to work. And then also that the control systems are then programmed to appropriately to take advantage of those. We have centrally controlled systems, and really what that is taking these type of devices and kind of connecting them all together. So for like a large parks department, so for a parks department, they might want to be able to communicate with all of their controllers from a central location. And so it allows them to share data between those controllers, turn them all on or off or adjust them kind of globally. And we'll talk more about that later. So when you hear smart technologies, the Irrigation Association has kind of adopted what they call the SWAT program. And it stands for Smart Water Application Technologies. And it's kind of a partnership between manufacturers, water purveyors, and so forth to try to determine, if certain technologies really are kind of meeting the standards required. So this program kind of promotes these available technologies, and they've set up a protocol for testing and then kind of SWOT labeling. So you can look at a system, and if it has the SWOT label on it, you know that it's been tested and met these minimal criteria. And so they're doing that for climate-based controllers, sensor-based, and also central control systems. So we talk about climate-based, like I was saying, ET, evapotranspiration. There's different ways. I talked about these weather stations and ET gauges. There's also systems where you can look at historical ET data. So they might have historical data programmed into the controller, and you just select your zone, and it kind of gives you a general guideline historically, what the ET rate is for different times of the year. So you get some level of adjustment. This is kind of a graph showing this is the months of the year, and then kind of the evapotranspiration. So the the water requirements go up in the summer, and then they dip back down. So you can see that the actual water requirements vary, almost daily. And then you take in, really, this is just looking at historical data, but if you look at actual data, we then get a line that kind of goes up and down all the way. And so the average of that might be somewhat lower than this. So the difference between just using the historical data versus using real-time data can even further reduce the amount of water that could be saved. And so that data can be gathered. There's web-based data from kind of weather station networks where they broadcast that evapotranspiration number to the controller on a daily basis. And there's local networks that do that as well. Denver Water transmits information for the weather reach, or the rain. There's a Rainbird product also that does the same thing, where they can utilize local Denver-based weather data. And so and the remote communications is often required in some form or another to share that data or to receive the ET data. So then the soil moisture technologies, there's different types, the water on demand and the suspended cycle. This TDT technology is some of the technology that's very successful. Anyway, as I mentioned before, measures the actual moisture level in the root zone. So central control systems, we've done a lot of work with these, working with different cities and different entities that want to implement these type of systems. And they're quite complex, they're very costly, requires ongoing communication capabilities to communicate with all of the various sites. But they can provide a lot of benefits to larger properties, park departments, and so forth. So they kind of allow the smarts in this smart technology to be shared among many sites without having to have weather stations and all this information or all these systems on every site. So they enable the system manager to monitor the water use and the overall operation of the system, kind of from a central location. And now with the way communications are, often that's via a web-based either a web-based kind of program, or they can access their computer web via the web, so that they can manage their system really from anywhere. So a lot of them also have advanced flow management technology. So we have flow sensors built into the system. So when a certain zone comes on, the system knows what the flow should be for that zone, and it can measure what's the actual flow. And if it doesn't match within a certain percentage, it can indicate that there's some kind of a problem, whether it's a break in the system or whatever else might be going on, so that it can be addressed immediately instead of waiting until there's a flood somewhere or the plants die or whatever. So a lot of them have radio remote capabilities, which are nice for maintenance people. They can walk around with a little walkie-talkie kind of device, or even their cell phone, where you can just control the controllers without having to run back and forth. And then system reporting is important because you can get reports on, daily, monthly, annual water use. All kinds of reports are available with these systems to help the person managing the system to understand how they're doing and how much water they're using or saving. So there's a myriad of communications options nowadays. Most all of these systems can utilize, any combination of these type of communication options. So again, just managing large sites. I think we kind of talked about this one. So when you talk about these systems, it's very critical that they're kind of planned out, and that they're not just kind of thrown in and implemented haphazardly. There's kind of a lot of planning that needs to go into these to make sure, one, that you have a system that really the user can utilize, and a system that functionally has the features that a specific user might need. So it's important to kind of look at what are the control systems, identify the goals and priorities of whoever's going to be managing it or running the system, identify the technologies that are available, and then often these things need to be implemented in phases. So looking at a phasing strategy that allows them to use available budget and to start applying that in some kind of logical fashion. Often we want to start implementing these things in areas where you can realize the biggest savings first, because it is a large investment. I'm not going to get too much into all this planning, but we often go through a kind of a system inventory. This is where we had all the parks data in a database, a GIS database, and we could then look at this and say, okay, the existing park system uses all of these types of controllers, and here's where they're at. And it's a great tool for figuring out how to start implementing the system and how many controllers are there to replace, and if you have communications in a given area, it really helps in developing a communication network to ultimately serve all of these controllers if they were converted to a central control system. So we look at, what are the needs of each park site. The city of Laramie is implementing a system now, and we worked with them we kind of took a look at every park site, determined what equipment was going to be required, and so we could come up with a solid estimate for them on what the cost would be for their implementation. And we did this for all of the park sites. So a few things that I talked about before. Who's going to manage the system? How many sites are going to be served? Do you need multiple control units? What are the water sources you're dealing with? What kind of pressures are there? Are you going to have pumps and so forth in the system? What are the communication methods that work within that area, and what's the availability of different communication methods? What kind of power do you have? Do you need to utilize, we have remote sites where we've utilized solar power. And then, just system retrofit planning. So as you have a system that you've got to convert from one system to another, how are you going to most effectively do that? So, if you have a business and you want to implement some of these technologies, if you have very many sites that you have to deal with, you want to kind of look at what portions of the system might be reusable, what do you need to replace, and can it be done in phases, or how are you going to attack that? We've kind of come up with a process where we look at all these factors and come up with some selection criteria to try to help large users of these central systems determine what systems they really need, what features they need, and then how they might most effectively be implemented. And so we can then come up with kind of a budget, look at over a given timeline, how much money are they going to need to spend each year in order to implement the system? What are the total equipment costs? How much do you think we can reduce the irrigation demand? What are the water costs currently and then projected into the future for each year? And what that does is it allows us to look at the kind of the potential implementation costs, as well as how much we can reduce the irrigation over that timeline, and kind of come up with a cost-benefit analysis. So in this case, if you started in 2010 and went through 2014, as you start out here, you're not, you kind of have this accumulated water cost savings that you're going to have every year. And in this scenario, over that timeline, there's a potential of saving about $935,000 on their water usage versus the cost of implementation. So in each year, in year one, it's costing us money to put the thing in. Year two, it's costing us money. And as we start getting more sites online and managing them better, we start to see in years 4 and 5 that we're actually having a positive cash flow now because we're saving water, even though we're still spending money to implement the system. So it's a valuable tool for the user to see, what's the benefit going to be. The big thing to look at is, that's just 5 years. Now you take this savings and extend it over 20 years, it becomes really substantial. So really, even though the cost to implement some of these systems seems really huge, the potential savings, when you start looking at the escalating water rates and so forth, is substantial. Just kind of looking at planning these systems out, we go out and look at what kind of communications, how well can we communicate from a central point out to all the controllers, and then what kind of systems do we use to communicate. And this is kind of geared a little more towards maybe not so much to this group, so I hope I'm not boring you with all this, but anyway, it shows some of the capabilities and some of the technologies that are available, and it really is pretty high tech nowadays as far as what can be done in the management of water and irrigation systems. So I'm just going to go really quickly through just a few projects and kind of what the scenario was. So, and it might give some ideas to things that you could do with your sites or businesses or whatever. So this is a site that utilized, this is a residential development that utilized, these various technologies, and water had a water source from wells that fed into ponds that were an amenity on site, and then they were used also for irrigation. This site was ultimately managed by the Homeowners Association. So they wanted this fancy control system, but they really didn't have anybody to manage it. And so we had to work with them to help them understand what was going to be required for them to manage the system that they had. This is a college campus, Fort Lewis College in Durango. So they implemented a central control system, and they were irrigating. They had an old pump, and they were irrigating basically 24 hours a day. They were having to run their system in order to water everything. And they had just standalone controllers and this old pump that was just cranking out and cycling on and off all day. Anyway, having a lot of problems. And they implemented a new pump system, but also a central control system. And once they got to where they had proper pressure and proper management of the system, they were able to get their irrigation done in 8 hours during the night. And at almost a 60% savings. I mean, it was really substantial because they were just overwatering everywhere. So with the implementation of a central system, and they had an on-site weather station, and were immediately able to, really crank that water use down, but also reduce the, because they had to water all day. Of course, they have students walking around getting squirted, and areas that are muddy and people walking through them, just all kinds of problems. So it's a really great example. Denver, the city of Boulder, they had an existing Motorola system, and they kind of went through this analysis. They were very interested in implementing soil moisture sensing technology. So they're looking at implementing some controllers that have soil moisture based capabilities, and eventually replacing their other system. So Denver Parks, they had a similar thing. They had some central control type controllers, and they wanted to, what kind of system do we use to manage all of our parks? What's most cost effective? And so they're working on getting more of their parks online. And for them, with the number of sites, so over almost 800 existing units, the water savings potential is really tremendous. And then the city of Laramie, they're working on installing a system now, and just looking at how they're managing. They're doing pretty good with what they have, but they're going to be able to do much better, and they'll be able to save a lot of water and a lot of man hours in their management process. And then we're also working with the city of West Jordan, Utah, and they're kind of doing a similar thing. They have an old system that isn't really working for them, and there's a lot of great technology now that they want to look at and figure out how to best implement a new system. All right, so just kind of in closing, we can, if there's any questions or comments, but I found a couple of quotes that I thought were good. I really like the one about don't throw away the old bucket until you know the new one holds water. Okay, so those are things we can all learn from. So thanks for your time, and if there's any questions, or feel free. Yes. So the question is, we have sites where people put in these systems and then they're not really able to utilize them, and then how do we help them out with that? It's something we've seen quite a lot, both in some of these cities that have come and said, we have the system. The city of Boulder is one, for example, that had this great system, and they're doing pretty good. They were doing pretty well with it, but I guess they're probably not the best example. They were actually doing fairly well. Maybe the city of West Jordan had the same kind of system, and they're really not using it. Maybe the guy, when it was first put in 15, 20 years ago, somebody managed it well, but over time it's been really a complex system to maintain. So they've kind of stopped using it, and they're back to kind of just using standalone type controllers. But we have a lot of clients that projects where they want a certain system in. We design it, we put it in, and then we find out later that they're not really using it because they really didn't plan on somebody to manage that system. So I think it's much better now than it used to be. But
do you view that as part of your package too?
We would love to be able to come in and help them manage it, and in some cases we have. What we find is often kind of toward the end of the project they're out of money and they're not wanting to pay somebody on an ongoing basis. So I think really what it needs to be is the maintenance companies really need to step up and learn how to manage these systems so that they can provide that service, in addition to mowing the lawn and doing other things. All right. Anything else? Okay, well, thank you for your time, and I appreciate it.